All right, thanks everybody for joining in today. Welcome to the COPRI Coastal Engineering Sciences Committee Technical Lunch and Learn. This is the 8th in a series of technical webinars that have been organized by this COPRI committee. For those of you that haven't joined us before, we plan to host a webinar every few months on varying topics that we feel are relevant to people with an interest in the coast, whether they be engineers, scientists, planners, officials, or just coastal residents. Some of you are likely familiar with COPRI and some of you may not be. COPRI is the Coasts, Oceans, Ports, and Rivers Institute of the American Society of Civil Engineers, or ASCE. Within COPRI, there are many ways for interested practitioners to get involved through local chapters, technical committees, and also student chapters. The Coastal Engineering Sciences Committee is one of several technical committees within COPRI, and one of our core initiatives is outreach. So our group developed this technical lunch and learn series to provide a way for the coastal community to engage with each other and learn about recent large and impactful projects, research, and initiatives. We open this up on a national platform and hope it fosters discussion amongst a diverse group. Today we have over 115 registrants from at least 13 countries. All right, on to today's presentation. I would like to introduce Dr. Leslie Ewing and Jeremy Smith. Jeremy is from the California Coastal Commission, and Leslie is recently retired from the commission. Today, they will discuss some of the newer options for shore protection, like living shorelines, and how, as a regulatory agency, the commission is able to encourage such projects. The presentation will also provide some examples of living shorelines that have been permitted recently by the commission. Leslie and Jeremy are planning for some robust discussion after the presentation, including suggestions from the audience for types of project monitoring information that could help determine the efficacy and improve future designs. We plan for Leslie and Jeremy to speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, with plenty of time for questions and discussion following the presentation. Please type in your questions during or after the presentation using the chat feature, or you can use the raise hand feature after the presentation and we'll unmute you. You could verbally provide questions in that manner if you choose. All right, take it away, Leslie and Jeremy.
Thanks so much, Chris. And the next slide shows sort of a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Chris has already helped with who we are. But thank you so much for asking us to speak today, and also Megan Wengrove for having suggested this for us to get involved with. So we're going to be talking about who we are, which you know, need for living shorelines. Then I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy, who's going to talk about examples of living shorelines from California and some of the definitions and how we treat them, and then go back to the topic title of are these new tools or a new toolbox, and then open it up for discussion and questions. So as the next slide shows, living shorelines are needed really not that differently than any other type of shoreline protection project. They're a response to coastal flooding, to coastal erosion, and efforts like that on behalf of nature that are threatening coastal development. And as the next slide shows, we've been having coastal erosion and flooding for millennia. And this is a California view where the green is where the shoreline used to be about 18,000 years ago, and then the shoreline where it is today. And I'm mostly focused on California, so I've looked at this type of image a lot. I know that on the East Coast, which is on the next slide, there has been a lot of change as well. And it's been dramatic. It's been huge amounts of change going between where the shoreline was during ice periods and non-ice periods. And looking at these two together, my apologies that, next slide, please. Sorry, Jeremy, thank you. Apologies that the Great Lakes aren't shown here, but they too respond to water levels. They just aren't responding as much to the rising sea level that we're seeing today in the oceans. But all of this is representing the idea that the water level changes are happening. The shoreline has been moving. It's been responding to storm waves, hurricanes, tropical storms, tsunamis. They've been attacking the coast, The beaches have been moving inland, cliffs have been eroding, barrier beaches have been doing rollovers. There's been a lot of change. And for thousands of years, excuse me, reefs, river deltas, beaches, wetlands, dunes have all been dampening the wave energy. They've been sort of the natural level of protection that was part of this dynamic change that's been going on for thousands of years. But going fast forward to the next slide, the coast is real different than it was thousands of years ago. And what we're dealing with today is very different than the shorelines we were dealing with in the past. All the forces like flooding and erosion are still there. They still exist, but the landslide, excuse me, the land side is far less adaptive. The inland development is now separated from the water by seawalls, by concrete, by levees, by tide gates and elevation. So lots of concrete, lots of rock, not a lot of what was there thousands of years ago. And then, as you see in the next slide, this has been the case at a lot of scales. It's been at the community scale as well as the large urban scale. And one of the things we're realizing is that shoreline protection has been in place long enough that we're seeing the benefits from it. We're seeing that it does protect inland development. But we're also seeing that it's reducing beach size. It's reducing beach access. It's affecting nearshore habitats. And there's beach access, of course, and then also the aesthetics. And for many of the reasons, people who visit the coast are now thinking that maybe shoreline protection isn't the best thing to be doing, or at least the traditional types of shoreline protection that we've been seeing. Next slide, please. So nobody comes to the coast and says, gee, this looks like a great view, but I'd love to see a seawall here. You know, it's just not where we're thinking. This is the type of coast, this is the type of shoreline view people want to see in the ideal setting. And so one of the pluses of living shorelines, next slide, is that they have the appearance of being a natural feature. They look like a place you want to go and walk around and see the area. They seem to be something that hasn't been manipulated and hasn't been so modified by human activity. It's the way the coast might have been before we came here. Next slide. Of course, underlying many of these living shorelines, you've got a traditional type of protection. You're going to have rocks or concrete or some type of walls and drainage stuff that's part of that underlying component of a living shoreline. But what people want to see, what people want to think of as their coast, is that more soft, gentle approach. Next slide, please. Now, public sentiment can be a strong reason for change, a strong reason for thinking more about living shorelines. But there's another trend that's been pushing for the idea of a living shoreline, and that's sea level rise. Pretty much all the US, except for upper parts of Canada and parts of the Pacific Northwest, have been experiencing sea level rise. And all indications are that it has been accelerating in recent years and that it will keep accelerating in the future. And of course, everybody knew we're going to be talking about sea level rise in some context with any discussion we've got. But the big lessons from sea level rise are that the coast is changing. And that change is going to grow in significance and frequency in the future. And we can't continue to keep protecting the coast in the same ways we have historically. Or at least we can't continue with that historic type of protection without thinking about what we're doing and considering options for it. So all of which is causing us to look more carefully at the idea of a living shoreline. Next slide, please. But just as we're looking at living shorelines because of sea level rise, we're also looking at them because of the urban areas. We've been seeing a lot of increase in tidal flooding and a lot of increase in urban flooding areas and flood days per year. This record shows that back in the 1950s, 1960s, there's sort of one, maybe two events, then up to 3 events in the 1970s, and it's just been growing since then. It's now a fairly frequent event that we are seeing in our urban areas. Next slide, please. One of the things, though, that we're recognizing is that most of the infrastructure that's right along the coast, roads, stormwater treatment plants, wastewater facilities, they're built in the shoreline, along the shoreline or low-lying areas, were built when we were doing major construction and infrastructure development. Following World War II, following the Clean Water Act, and those things are now influencing when we did things, and those were built when we were having infrequent flood days, infrequent concerns about sea level rise. A lot of that infrastructure is now 50, 60, 70 years old, and it's been maintained, it's been patched together, it's been held together, and it's been replaced in some cases. But in a lot of situations, we're starting to think about rebuilding some of that urban infrastructure and how that's going to be done. And again, living shorelines come into that consideration. If you think about not just taking one piece of this urban system and treating it, but if you think about looking at it as a bigger whole. And that's part of the adaptation idea that many communities are starting to look at. But now the next slide, please. Living shorelines aren't really the answer for everything. It's not a panacea, but it is becoming something we're thinking about more, looking at more in the context of an overall systemic way of addressing the coast in a different fashion. And I'm now going to turn this over to Jeremy Smith, who's going to be discussing living shorelines and some of how those are some of a part of the solutions that we're looking at least in California. Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks, Leslie. So what makes a shoreline living? An obvious answer would be that there's life on it, like vegetation or oysters, but I think the field has started to take a broader view here. Living shorelines are part of a larger category of adaptation solutions under the umbrella of nature-based solutions. So nature-based, in my opinion, speaks to a sort of philosophical perspective, where instead of trying to stop or substantially alter natural processes, one leans into them. This means utilizing both physical and ecological processes to achieve project goals. For example, the positive feedback loop of marsh or dune vegetation, where vegetation encourages sediment deposition, which then encourages vegetation growth. Living shorelines should also improve ecological systems, for example, by creating a more diverse set of coastal habitats and habitat types, which are part of a functioning coastal ecosystem. In California, a good example is coastal dunes, many of which we have lost as a part of coastal development over the decades. By creating or restoring coastal dune systems, not only can we provide more flood protection, but we can restore the ecological and physical connection between coastal dunes and sandy beaches. Living shorelines are often talked about in contrast to harder solutions like coastal armoring, but in reality, projects can utilize a combination of more natural components with harder components, like buried revetments and small groins, as Leslie was talking about. Some hybrid solutions also rely more heavily on restoring more dynamic physical processes, like the way cobble berms can be used to provide additional resistance to erosion and dissipate wave energy that are more conducive to sandy beach recovery. I think there are some bigger picture strategies that living shorelines try to utilize to be successful. The first is making space. So this involves studying the project site and extent of the dynamic shoreline processes and either siting infrastructure away from this dynamic extent or creating space in the form of sediment placement. The next is buffer and absorb. So vegetation, varied topography, and gentle slopes all can be used to buffer incoming wave energy, making it easier to design for in a softer way on shore. Another is promoting sediment retention. So in California, shorelines are often sediment starved. There are many natural examples of systems that encourage sediment to settle and stay put for longer. That can be seen in living shoreline designs. Of course, elevation can be critical for flooding, and using elevation in strategies like sand dunes is key for their performance. Lastly, looking at ways we can design systems to recover fully or partially on their own, something rarely seen in harder solutions. Dunes and marshes can reestablish or even grow over time. This is of particular interest in California, where the biggest threat is often a strong and persistent El Niño season with a series of storms that may come back to back to back. Of course, the kinds of solutions available are highly dependent on the coastal context. This is part of why California and other West Coast regions have had difficulty implementing the kind of living shorelines developed in the sheltered estuaries of the East and Gulf coasts. There are also different kinds of challenges that living shorelines are used to address, namely the issues of coastal flooding and coastal erosion, which are often, but not always, tend to be co-located. In our work at the Commission, we've tried to categorize the broad range of softer solutions available to practitioners by coastal setting and issue. When we talk about sheltered coasts, we're referring to the coastal lagoons and estuaries that are not exposed to ocean swell, in contrast to the open coast, which is often exposed to very high wave energy. We have beaches or beachfront development and bluffs and bluff-top development, both of which can be exposed to both chronic and episodic marine erosion. Static water level flooding refers to flooding in low-lying areas from high water levels, not considering waves. Think places that flood on a king tide. Conversely, we have flooding from both fetch-limited waves and sheltered lagoons, which tend to be much smaller, and the wave-related flooding during large swell and high tides on our open coast. All right, so with that said, I wanted to show you all a table we developed for our critical infrastructure sea level rise adaptation guidance last year. It lists out some potential options for softer and hybrid solutions that may be appropriate for the various issues in coastal settings in California. I'll point out a few of these and talk about some ones I see as promising concepts here. Pictured on the right are a few interesting examples. So artificial reefs or submerged breakwaters could potentially be used in a variety of coastal settings. It involves a shallow, usually rock structure offshore that is used to dissipate wave energy, thereby reducing erosion and flooding inshore. There are also horizontal levees, also called ecotone levees, which are essentially gently sloping levees with restored wetland and upland habitat that works to buffer waves, allowing the levees to be shorter than they might need to be otherwise. We have rock platform and vegetation. That refers to this approach taken on a fluvial bluff in Mad River up in Northern California, where rocks provided a sturdy base from which a slope with willows and woody debris could be established to stabilize the slope while providing aquatic and upland habitat. Lastly, I'll point out oyster beds and reefs, which in California have had mixed success. Our substantial tide range means that these oyster features likely don't establish at high enough elevations to make robust differences to wave dissipation, though there's still a tool that can be used in a more diverse approach to living shorelines. So if you're interested in seeing the full appendix on nature-based adaptation strategies in our critical infrastructure sea level rise adaptation guidance, I'll post a link to the report in the chat. I did want to quickly cover two living shoreline approaches that we've encountered in our work that I think are particularly promising. So the first are marsh sills, and this is sort of a broad reference to marsh sills. Marsh sills are more broadly refer to rock, gravel, or some other coarse-grained sediment that fronts an existing or restored intertidal marsh plain. So there are naturally occurring examples of this in the shoreline in places like San Francisco Bay. The coarser, more erosion-resistant edge allows for intertidal marsh habitat to establish by dissipating waves that would otherwise pull fines offshore or cause marsh scarping. In Humboldt Bay, GHD worked with Humboldt County on a feasibility study, and over the course of their collaboration with stakeholders like our agency, ended up proposing a restored marsh plain stabilized by a gravel shingle beach. This is expected to provide the elevation and roughness needed to reduce wave overtopping and flooding of a critical roadway corridor up in Humboldt Bay, Highway 101. So next we have the famous cobble and sand dune approach. So as I mentioned, dunes are a precious coastal habitat in California, and there's been increasing momentum to restore or construct dunes, not just for their ecological benefits, but their potential to create more resilient shorelines. The inspiration of this power combo comes from California's naturally cobbly beaches near the mouths of coastal rivers and creeks. Historically, before damming and hardscaping their watersheds, these creeks provided sand and cobble to beaches. Cobbles ended up sinking in the beach profile to lower elevations, creating cobble layers underneath dune beach systems. During winter storms, the beach erodes and the cobble shifts and steepens, stabilizing the dunes on top long enough to provide the elevation necessary to reduce overtopping. After the storm, the cobble berm flattens and promotes beach recovery, which can then in turn lead to dune recovery, or that's the idea at least. This concept has been implemented in various forms in California. So one in Ventura in the Surfers Point project, where retreat of a parking lot and bike path allowed for a more resilient backshore dune system. and in Cardiff and San Diego County, where dunes with a cobble toe and periodic beach nourishment have created a much-loved coastal feature that helps reduce flooding of a coastal road. This concept is also being proposed again in Orange County, where we at the Commission have been working extensively with the County Parks Department on a rapidly eroding beach park to develop and test a pilot living shoreline project to inform longer-term adaptation planning at the site. Now I'd like to talk about some other project we permitted in hopes to pull out some meaningful insights. First, a less engineered project in Santa Monica. This project was focused on restoring natural, ecological, and physical processes otherwise disrupted by the routine beach grooming that is commonplace for many urban beaches in Southern California. Beach grooming is essentially raking the beach. So beach grooming is mainly to get rid of trash and debris on heavily used sandy beaches, but it has the effect of grooming away any plants that colonize the dry beach as well. The Bay Foundation worked on developing a pilot project in a small section of Santa Monica Beach, where they put up some sand fences, planted native dune plants, and worked with the county to stop grooming in that small portion. What resulted was the return of sand dunes. So these hummocky dunes have been working to retain windblown sand and building up in elevation. While not designed to reduce extreme flooding, the project has demonstrated how natural processes can be used to create more resilient coastal landscapes. The lessons learned from a 5-year monitoring program have already been used in other living shoreline projects elsewhere in the state. While this project went through our normal permitting process, similar projects have been able to be permitted through a much quicker waiver process, due in part to the lessons learned from the monitoring report for this project. So last, we have the West Trail Living Shoreline Project in Pillar Point Harbor near Half Moon Bay, about an hour's drive south of San Francisco along the open coast. So a trail runs along the western edge of this harbor that runs out to the world-famous Maverick Surf Break. The trail is heavily used by walkers and occasionally necessary as an emergency access route during the big wave surf events. So the initial proposal here was actually for a soil nail wall, basically a seawall, the kind of hard armoring that is very difficult to approve under the California Coastal Act, which the Coastal Commission gets its permitting authority from. Knowing the regulatory headwinds that would face an application of such kind, and with leadership from the Harbor District Commission, the district pursued a more natural approach. The hypothesis that consultants GHD and ESA proposed was that what was once a beach before the harbor jetties were installed has now been the head of a net longshore transport away from the trail from waves that are diffracting through the harbor entrance. So the vertical scarp that you see on the right here was in a cycle of undermining and failure. And so the idea was to restore a more gradual slope with a cobble base that's stabilized in the longshore direction by low relief rock fingers, basically small groins. All this would be topped by a dune system to provide additional habitat and flood reduction benefits. The design was largely inspired by a more stable dune beach system on the other side of the small headland you see in the very left of the design. So the idea was that the rock fingers would mimic this modest natural retention feature and help orient the shoreline to a more stable geometry. Commission staff were supportive of this more natural approach, even with the harder elements, given that they were necessary and the least environmentally damaging alternative to address the erosion at the site. The project includes extensive monitoring program, both to evaluate the project's performance and assess any impacts that may occur as a result of borrowing sand from up coast. The project finished construction earlier this year and is waiting for a rainier season to plant the dunes and bioswales that were also part of the project. The project will be an interesting one to track. When talking to the project design manager, Brian Leslie, he mentioned that sourcing all the cobble and quarry rock for the rock fingers was a challenge, since part of the design included trying to match the aesthetic qualities of the native materials, and that was hard to source easily. It's my understanding that the project was also funded entirely by the Harbor District. So that makes it kind of unique. It's one of the first living shoreline type projects to be implemented in California that's not funded by state or federal grants. I hope that has given you a good taste of some of the living shorelines we are seeing in California. I think the large shift towards these more nature-based solutions is partly a result of the strong environmental policies of the Coastal Commission that require applicants to consider alternatives to hard armoring. Greater financial and technical support from other state agencies like the Coastal Conservancy and championing from local government and community partners have helped develop what I think will be a robust base of pilot projects that will inform more implementations and policy improvements going forward. So this map I made here shows where these types of projects are currently being studied or going through the permitting process, with the darker green ones already permitted or constructed. I'll now hand it back to Leslie to take us home.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I mean, as Jeremy has shown, these types of living shorelines are not so much, they're fundamentally very different than you see from the traditional type of armoring, at least in the California coast that we're seeing. This bottom picture is another shot of the Ventura shoreline that Jeremy talked about at Surfers Point, which has got the cobble underlayer and then dune materials on it and walkways so that people can enjoy the dunes, get to the beach, and also get down to the surf spot that's there. But as the next slide shows, really we're talking about sort of fundamental differences in some ways between these two systems, between a living shoreline and a traditional engineered type of protection feature. And because of that, we really need to start thinking about the living shoreline concept early in the design process, early in the consideration, because they're not really going to be replaceable when you get back to the point of saying, well, we've got this problem, we've got to do something, and we figured out all the things we can do. We've got this great design. We've done our rock sizing with Hudson's equation, and we know what we're going to do, and then say, well, maybe we should think about a living shoreline at that point. It really starts from the very beginning of looking at the problem and looking at what options and ideas you have for it. So it starts at the design stage, where you're going to need input from both the engineers and probably biologists, oceanographers, and others to figure out what the main conditions and driving forces are going to be and what you can do in that area. You're going to need to think about space differently. It's going to have to take up a probably larger area and longer area. So you're going to be looking at longshore and offshore changes in the way you look at your problem site. It's not going to be just the location where the wall needs to be located, but it's going to be the locations where that greater space is needed. You're probably going to have to start looking at different expectations as well. It's not going to be something that's going to be once and done. It's going to stay there. It's not going to be a type of thing that you could do with a 50-year core permit and then walk away from it and think that everything is finished. There's going to be work you're going to be needing to do throughout the longer time, throughout the time it's there, that will be part of what is in that toolbox or the tool of using a living shoreline. The uses and users are probably going to be different as well. I mean, the uses for many of the type of traditional shore protection we have are going to be the upland users. But then the living shoreline is more focused on the users, both human and non-human users, who are part of that shoreline system, part of the beach areas, part of the offshore or nearshore areas as well. Construction is going to be different. We're going to be thinking about plantings and drainage and subdrains and some of the things we also think about for traditional engineering, but at different scales. And as Jeremy was talking about, trying to source materials is going to be a very different type of challenge at times than it is when you're talking about more traditional type of engineering approaches. Monitoring schedules and triggers could also be different rather than just a 5-year go out and look at it again. Most likely there could be triggers for when there's going to be a major storm and frequent storms coming back to back and how you're going to monitor those and looking at the volumes of sand and the plant health, not just whether the rocks have moved. It's going to be a very different, it is a very different way of looking at how we treat these constructed living shorelines from the constructed engineered shorelines. Monitoring schedules are going to be different. What we look at in those monitoring needs, we're going to probably not just have engineers going out and looking at them or surveyors. We're going to need biologists going out and looking at them. Maybe folks who are looking for bird counts and doing other things so that we're taking into an account that sort of bigger holistic approach to monitoring and success of these types of living shorelines than we're doing for the existing traditional shorelines. Maintenance and maintenance needs are going to be different as well. It may be that we have to do maintenance on a fairly frequent basis, replanting things, keeping those edges and stuff going and healthy so that the whole shoreline can continue to work as that bigger system and not just going out every 5 or 10 years and replacing some of the rock or treating the spalling concrete. I don't mean to belittle any of the monitoring and maintenance we're doing on our traditional structures, but it's going to be very different. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. And then the other part with living shorelines, it's often part of the design consideration of those, is that they are a transition to something else, that eventually they may be overwhelmed by the amount of sea level rise we have. It's not something we want to consider and think about, but it is something that's possible. And so we need to be monitoring those to think about what we need to do next and transition perhaps into something more robust, or, possibly consider relocation of some of the at-risk facilities so that the whole system continue to function in a credible and dynamic way. So going to the next slide, please. This idea of, is it a new tool for the toolbox or a whole new toolbox? And my thought on this is that we're at a turning point. I'd love to hear people's ideas on this and also what you think we should be doing as far as those monitoring and maintenance of these facilities, these new types of shorelines. But part of the idea now is that we are going into an idea of adaptation for the coast. We're doing adaptation plans, identifying vulnerabilities, and that living shorelines are part of that adaptation toolbox. And we've got toolboxes on a bunch of different scales. We've got the toolbox of being the adaptation toolbox overall. And in that, we've got a living shoreline. But when we think about how we're going to be doing our construction of shoreline protection, so many of the features of a living shoreline differ from those of more traditional engineering. I think we do need to think about them as a new toolbox within that part of the idea of how we're going to be treating the coast in the future. From the way we start fundamentally planning our projects, to the way we do monitoring and maintenance, and the way we think about the coast as being a dynamic system again. And I think for those who are looking at the coast in a big system, we really are talking about having living shorelines as part of this bigger shoreline infrastructure component of how we treat the coast, and we are starting to work with it. So, yep, next slide, thank you. And so really, we're up now at the point of talking and answering questions and having discussion on this. But part of what we're learning is that this has been taking a long time to get living shorelines to be considered seriously. It's not an overnight transformation of how we treat the coast, of how we deal with shoreline protection. We've been waiting. We've had the wisdom and patience to get to the point we're at now, and we need to move forward with perhaps a different way of looking at the shoreline. And as David Remnick has said, we have time to deal with climate change, but there will not be a better time. There will only be worse times. And in that, I think living shorelines are a component of that as either a tool or a toolbox or another solution. So with that, thank you so much for your patience, and let's have some questions.
Great. Well, thank you for Leslie and Jeremy for that presentation. I see that we do have several questions already in the chat. So what we'll do is we'll start working through those from the ones that were submitted first. But as I mentioned at the beginning, you can submit questions through that chat feature, or if you want to use the raise hand feature, and we will work to unmute you, and then you call your name and you'd be able to ask the question and then have a dialogue with the presenters through that means as well. All right, so with that, first question we had was from Colin Averill, who says, has the CCC ever permitted an artificial reef or submerged breakwater? If not, why not? And how could they be incorporated in the future?
Okay, so I've got the history on this, so I'll answer this one, or at least start it and then let Jeremy follow up. But yeah, we did an artificial reef many years ago that was part of a mitigation for surf impacts that happened down in El Segundo. And a submerged reef, a surfing reef was put in, and it was permitted by the Coastal Commission. Unfortunately, as was the removal of that surf reef. It didn't work at the time. It didn't work to either promote surfing or to establish a better beach area. And I think a lot of it was that the design was too small and the effort was multi-focused, and we really didn't have the clear ideas of how to do that reef that we might have had now were to have been put in place. The intent was not to do a big narrow neck surf reef, but to do something smaller. And it was not an effective project, but we have been thinking about ways the Coastal Commission that I used to work with, have been thinking about ways to retain sand. I mean, for us in California, one of the biggest problems we have is that we don't maintain sand on our beaches for a very long time in many locations. And it goes down submarine canyons, which we don't know what it does down there. We don't know if that's an important factor for a submarine canyon or if it's just, from our purposes, being lost to the beach. And so there are considerations of putting in some type of structures that will slow and retain sand. You want to add more, Jeremy?
Yeah, I'll just say that I believe we've also permitted other kinds of artificial reefs that weren't necessarily designed for attenuating a lot of wave energy. But we did permit some oyster ball reefs in San Diego Bay and some artificial reefs as more of like a restoration mitigation project for the nuclear generating station at San Onofre in San Clemente. But I think the reason why we haven't seen a lot of proposals is because these things are really expensive when you start to get at the scale that's needed. I think there's been a few cities that have looked at them in their alternatives analysis, but then ultimately decided that the benefits weren't worth the cost.
And to add on that more, there is the idea that we want these projects to at least do no harm. So if they're identified as having adverse effects on the shoreline, then there's the question about removal. And removal, as we learned from the reef at Dockweiler, El Segundo, removal can be really expensive to do.
That information. The next question came from Robert Prager. I see, there we go. He had his hand raised, now it's down, so I'll just ask a question. How do you keep the course material from sinking into the marsh muck in the marsh sills?
Yeah, Robert, do you want to speak to that, or sorry, you're on mute.
Yes, I was going to say first on the reefs, there's some very preliminary work coming out from Florida from Ian that the artificial reefs did not perform very well during Hurricane Ian that we just experienced down in Fort Myers. The natural reefs seem to do better. Mostly they've been covered up with sand, and the only thing left are the reef fish looking for the reef. But what I was gonna, other ones, the question is just there. How are you keeping the course material there? Because when we do oyster bags here and we put them on the marsh, they just disappear until you pile up enough.
Yeah, well, your last sentence there was kind of the answer. So what GHD was looking at for that project was just basically doing a series of lifts of that gravel material until it stopped sinking.
Okay.
Yeah, it involves some, geotechnical analysis of how much sinking is expected.
Okay, thank you.
Kat asked, how does the CCC determine priority projects? Is it only based on threats to human life and buildings?
So priority projects, I'm not sure I'm necessarily getting what you mean by priority projects. We sort of, we have a process for emergencies and emergency permits where that imminent threat to life and property is considered. But then other permits are not necessarily prioritized in any way.
Question from Oregon State. is what's listed here. So someone associated with Oregon State. What kind of historical research is being done to ensure that the shorelines can accommodate the new living shorelines, i.e. the previous dunes, marshes, or natural inlets, so that the material and ecosystems do not erode?
Yeah, I can take a first stab at this, and Leslie, feel free to add, but that sort of historical research is something that we usually ask for when we're looking at applications for these kinds of projects. So some of the things we ask for, and we're lucky now to have new tools available to applicants. So for example, like CoastSat, or satellite derived shoreline beach widths, have been a really good tool in trying to get applicants to look at what has been the historic range of how this beach has fluctuated, how has historical nourishments contributed to maybe wider conditions that we're now seeing, more eroded conditions, and consider that range in sort of where you're siting these living shorelines, and whether or not you'll be able to have enough beach in front of them to perform well. So that's something we're looking at. And then, if that is not there, thinking, is there, some potential for a way to retain that sand a little bit more? And what is that through creating a little bit more room in the back shore for a dune system that could help store sand during, in the upper beach area, so during storms that sand can replenish the beach in front of it? Or is that something like a smaller groin?
And we have gotten fairly good offshore bathymetry recently through work by USGS, which is helping to identify transitional river deltas and where they've been. A couple of years, maybe it's decades ago now, or a decade or more ago, but folks are talking about doing delta enhancement as a way to reduce onshore wave energy, sort of an offshore reef that's already a component, it's already established there because you've got the offshore delta that was part of the river system. We also have a group in California that has been looking at historic wetlands. And so we've got a lot of information on those and can go back and see where the wetland areas used to be. Unfortunately, I guess we destroyed most of our wetlands in a recent enough time that we can learn from those and go back and find the soils, the right areas that would work for the wetland buffers as well.
Erin Benford has had her hand up for quite a bit. I'm going to see if she can unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I'm sure a lot of people on the call have had this experience, but from the private sector side, I think when we go into these types of analyses and projects, kind of doing consultations for clients on the East Coast, I know we've seen a lot of interest from the federal government in getting into the greener engineering side, mostly because they have, the greener initiatives, but we're also starting to see local communities and states getting involved in this. And I think kind of the shock for them when you propose these green structures and these living shorelines is that they're not necessarily thinking about the long-term, adaptive and monitoring parts of this and the ongoing cost. And I don't think that's probably the hardest part about consulting with clients on these types of things, is even though, the green structures may tend to perform better, it's trying to convince the person that you're doing the analysis for, the recommendation, that the ongoing maintenance and monitoring required for these types of structures is not that different from the gray engineering. Somebody has to go out and monitor a seawall. It's just, you might have to do it a little bit more often. And that's not necessarily saying that, you're going to have to do a whole lot of extra work to follow up on this. I think that conversation, we're kind of evolving in the way that we talk about that, trying not to scare kind of smaller communities and things away from these types of engineering, because I know on the East Coast, in a lot of areas, they perform much better than gray structures. So that's kind of the hard balance, I think, for us, is trying to make that conversation of adaptive management strategies and ongoing monitoring beneficial for them.
It sounds like you're doing a lot of the right things. You're talking about these projects in a large context. You're talking about a community, albeit sometimes a small community looking at these projects rather than having one person going it on their own. And I think as we have more projects available, there'll be more information to share. And so that there will be an increasing knowledge of what the big constraints, what the big opportunities are, what that monitoring really needs to entail. It may be that communities start by doing a little bit overdone monitoring and then figure out where they can pull back. So it's a learning process, and I'm glad that you're working closely with communities to help them into that learning process themselves. And it sounds like you're doing all the right stuff.
George Kaminsky says, comment on the toolbox, construction and adaptation and transition viewpoints. Part of living shorelines and natural and nature-based approaches is to think of the human construction design as that which restores natural processes and is not necessarily intended to be maintained as initially constructed. Rather, the initial construction can be thought of as adding the components to restore an enhanced, naturalized dynamic stability. More of a comment than a question there.
Yeah, George, I think it's a great comment. And I think that idea of restoring a process as opposed to thinking about a shoreline that's going to be fixed in place is a really important one. And I think that one that honestly I don't see as often as proposals to just do a cross section that's assumed to be maintained for some amount of time, right? I think that process-based thinking is something that's really important, and I hope to see more of in California.
And something Erin probably needs to add into her discussions with clients who are talking about living shorelines, that there will be adjustment periods and changes to this over time. Oh, goody, I got a thumbs up.
Right. Bill asks, for beach nourishment, perhaps parentheses, perhaps the only nature-based solution available for the open coast, should we begin utilizing material that is significantly coarser than the native sand?
That certainly has been a discussion that has taken place in California a lot, or was taking place in California a lot. And a lot of the values for beach areas as habitat depends significantly on the grain size that's there. I think perhaps more than the coarsening of the sand, you might think about adding vegetation, adding retention components through vegetation and vegetated dunes before you really coarsen the sand a lot. I mean, as you go to the extreme, you just put rock down because that's just a really, really huge sand grain. And we don't really want to see that going on. There's also research going on with much coarser sand, finding that the hydrodynamics of it and the way it responds is very different, and it may not get you the benefits that you might expect to see just because of the settling velocities and the different things we see with coarser sand. So it's not always going to be a win situation to go with coarser sediment.
Yeah, and I'll just add that this is something that we're definitely looking at and trying to consider as these beaches get more and more desperate for sand and wanting the sand to stay. And I think there's just also a lot of information needs for the regulatory agencies, not just for the Coastal Commission, but other regulatory agencies that are maybe more focused on specific species or habitat around what changing native grain size does to the beach in fauna. And there's just a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how those projects impact. So until we have sort of more evidence and information, we're in a tough spot from a regulatory standpoint. So folks who are doing research, that's big information gap.
Great discussion so far. I think we have about 5 questions currently in the chat still to go through, but you want to add more in, please do so. The next question was from M. Anderson, who wrote, have you ever permitted wave attenuation devices, large pyramids with holes and large jacks along the shoreline?
We've definitely permitted breakwaters, which I think would cover that. Maybe I'm not understanding the question as well.
I think these are kind of a specific wave focused, shape, I guess, but I've seen different types of shapes from kind of cylinders on poles and different things like that. So I'm not, maybe M. Anderson can provide a little bit more detail, or has to be unmuted and can provide a little bit more detail related to that. So.
Hi, my name is Maribel Anderson. I'm with Michael Baker International. So in the southern region of the US, we use wave attenuation devices, and it's not a breakwater because there's spaces in between them. So you anchor them on the ground, and what it does is it dissipates wave energy, but it also deposits sand behind it to create shoreline. So it's a way of restoring your shoreline or re-nourishing it without actually transporting sand, but letting nature takes its course. So in Europe, they use like large jacks, which is, the thing that you play with the ball when you were a kid, except they're just large. And here in the States, they use large, they're like pyramids, but it's got a whole bunch of holes in them. And what happens is the mangroves colonize them, and oysters and barnacles. So they serve like an artificial reef at the same time. And you can remove them after a certain, period of time. So I was wondering if you guys have permitted that in California.
I don't think we have.
No, we haven't seen those structures. We haven't seen them proposed either. So
Right.
Coastal Commission doesn't go out and make up projects, put together projects. That they come to us, and we're the regulatory portion of that.
Well, thank you. It's definitely something that we'd probably consider. I work with our California folks all the time, so.
I don't know where Chris went, but maybe we should start going through some of these questions.
Oh yeah, didn't he get popped off the call maybe?
I don't know, but
Oh yeah, he's in the waiting room. Okay. Yeah, I'll just say, there's a few of these. Is sea level rise included in the design of marsh and dunes restorations in order to allow retreat of these systems and keep pace with sea level rise? I think the way we look at these nature-based living shoreline type projects is, we don't expect it to last for a century. And so, the idea is that they're sort of monitored and maybe have a shorter design life, or are sort of this interim step. And so sea level rise is certainly thought about in the process, but it's not necessarily designed for in the design.
All right, Jeremy, keep going. I got kicked off the Zoom meeting. That hasn't happened, or the WebEx. That hasn't happened to me in a while. But because of that, I lost the only thing I have is the most recent question.
Oh,
So
right.
you're moving down the question list. You are now the question and answer guy.
so there's another about, are we considering regulation that would require the removal of failed hard shore protection structures, placing them with living shorelines? Well, we do have a regulation already at the Coastal Act that failed structures do need to be removed. We haven't really exercised that a lot, but it is certainly something that would be possible. So we wouldn't need new regulation, but we would not necessarily propose that a living shoreline replace it. That would have to come from the person who is removing it and putting together a replacement option.
But we would certainly, in the process of the proposing a replacement, ask them to consider more natural strategies if those are feasible.
Yeah. And then, shoot, I'm not scrolling up and down fast enough. Someone was saying that all these things that we're talking about aren't new, and I agree completely. But they're coming together in a new, with new attention to them. And I think that's been a good situation.
There's a question on, is there enough data on the maintenance of cobble berms underlying beach sand to understand how frequent maintenance might be needed relative to an unprotected beach? Have the use of feeder berms to feed littoral drift from the upstream side of these projects have been considered as a means of proactive beach maintenance? I don't think we've seen a lot of proposals for feeder berms, but that's certainly an interesting idea, and I hope folks do explore that on future projects. And the question about, is there enough data? I think we would say no, but there's been monitoring of Surfers Point, there's been monitoring of Cardiff, there will be monitoring of West Trail, and there will be monitoring of the Orange County proposal if that's approved. So I think that's a really good base, and all of those monitoring reports are public documents because they're required by our permits. And so I think the idea is that we're looking for folks who are interested in sort of piecing together all of this data and trying to pull out those insights. I think that would be really beneficial.
And I think we can't ignore wave climate. So it's not going to be ever a situation where we could just have a set routine maintenance and then go with it. Are we no, that's the same one again.
I think we have like 30 seconds left, but I'll just say, feel free to reach out to us with questions.
Yes.
We didn't answer them.
Thank you for the presenters. I don't see any other hands up or any other new questions in the last 5 minutes or so. So I appreciate everybody joining in. Appreciate Leslie and Jeremy taking the time to create and deliver the presentation. This was recorded. It will end up on the COPRI YouTube channel. So if you had a colleague or someone that wasn't able to attend and you think they'd be interested in it, look for that in a few weeks. And all the previous webinars are also up on the YouTube channel. That said, I see Robert has now raised his hand. Let's see if Robert had one more comment as we're winding down here.
Yeah, I noticed that someone had asked if there's any standards or anything out there, and I just wanted to bring to their attention that there's the International Guideline for Natural and Nature-Based Features for Flood Risk Management from the Corps of Engineers. And there is also the U.S. Department of Transportation's Nature-Based Solutions for Coastal Highway Resilience and Implementation Guide.
Thanks, Robert, for answering the question.
Yeah, thank you. And we pay a lot of attention to both of those.
All right. Well, with that, thank you everybody for joining in. Have a great rest of your day. And hold on, we still have one more question here that just came in from Francisco, who said, if there's still time for a question, do you have examples of living shorelines, NBS projects, and high energy exposed beaches with approximately 1 million meters cubed of littoral alongshore transport? That's a pretty specific.
I guess it's like, well, over what time is that? Maybe annual, but I think a lot of our open coast projects.
Sorry, I'm Francisco speaking here, if you don't mind. Yeah, it's per year.
Per
So
year?
annual alongshore transport. Just the order of magnitude. Just for
Yeah.
So I'm talking about high energy environment. And I believe California coast would have examples of those type of beaches. And if you have examples of any projects apart from beach nourishment.
Well, I think the Surfers Point project and the Cardiff project, I'm not sure what the longshore transport rates are there, but they are on the open coast and they are exposed to significant swell. So they might be good examples to look at.
Well, thank you, everybody. Also thank the attendees that typed in the questions and asked them. Having the dialogue after the presentation is great. It's the reason why we do it. So thank you for those as well. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you, Chris, for asking us to participate. Goodbye.